Hello everyone, and welcome to this week's virtual lecture, which is all about independent variables. So the independent variable, or IV, is really at the heart of a true experiment. So as a refresher, the independent variable is the variable that the research team manipulates in some way to investigate if it changes the dependent variable or the outcome in any way. So when looking at true experiments, they can generally be separated into two major categories. We have impact studies and judgment studies. So we're going to start with the impact studies here on the left. Basically, with impact studies, we want to see the impact of the independent variable. So in these different types of studies, the impact study is where the independent variable is thought to have a very powerful effect on either participants' cognitions or thoughts, feelings or emotions, and or behavior. Whereas judgment studies, on the other hand, participants are more so thought as observers who reflect on, recall, or react to a specific presented stimulus. So the next couple of slides will have more detailed examples of each. So we're going to start with the impact studies. So I've linked two YouTube videos here. They're relatively short. So please, before I talk about each one, take time to just watch the short clips to see what each study is really about. So starting with the Ash conformity study. So this is where they use the line judgment. So to give you a brief refresher beyond the video, but I recommend pausing this lecture and watching that video just to give yourself a refresher of what it was. But basically, what Ash did was he had one participant in a room filled with Confederates, and those Confederates either gave the correct answer or the incorrect answer on the line judgment assessment. So the Confederate responses had a very powerful impact on participants' responses and behavior, because as you may know, the outcome was that when participants were in a room with Confederates that were all giving the wrong answer, the participant, I do believe it was about 67% of the time, was conforming to those wrong answers, so they themselves were also giving the answer that they knew was incorrect just because the Confederates around them gave the incorrect answer as well. So next we have the Darley and Latane bystander effect. So there are a ton of different variations that investigate the bystander effect. So the original study I was not able to find videos of, but I wanted to give you a background of what the original study was and then talk about the one I linked. So in the original study, there were folks in a cubicle speaking to people on an intercom. So some only were speaking to one person. However, some participants were speaking to a number of people. And at one point, someone they were conversing with had a seizure. So I want to emphasize no one actually had a seizure. This was a Confederate. They found that the more people on this phone call, so on this intercom communication, the less likely the participant was to help the person having a seizure. So of course this is known as the bystander effect. So in the study that I linked here, this is called the smoke-filled room study. This is an impact study just about how being around people can also have an impact. So of course this is a social psych course. So I do want to say this video does not have sound, so there's nothing wrong with your computer or the audio. It just, for whatever reason, doesn't include sound. So in this study, there's a participant that's in a room. So the participant first is alone, and the room starts to fill with smoke. And basically what happens is the researcher times how long it takes people to go and get some help. So the person who was alone got up almost immediately after they noticed it and left fairly quickly, left the room. However, the last part of the video, you see that someone was in a room with other people. So the other people in the room were Confederates. And the room starts to fill up with smoke. And they still time to see how long the participant took to go and get some help. So you can see that there's a timer in the upper right hand corner that even after 5 minutes she's still sitting in the same spot. You can see her sort of looking around, seeing if anyone else is going to do anything, if anyone else even notices the smoke. And then finally, after 20 minutes, she was still sitting there, but they ended up calling her out of the experiment. So they found that the more Confederates in the room who were not doing anything, the longer it took the participant to go and get help. So this is also known as the diffusion of responsibility. So it sort of poses this question of whose responsibility is it when there are so many people around? What individual has the responsibility to take action? But there's also the question to see, you can tell her sort of looking around to see if anyone else is seeing the smoke as well. So this can be considered like informational social influence. So looking around and sort of trying to let someone else take the lead when you aren't sure what to do. So we saw some very crucial outcomes of this bystander effect, and we found that it's important that one perceives the situation as an emergency, and two, in order to take action, one has to believe that they are the one who needs to take action. So next we have the judgment studies. So again, judgment studies are where the participants are seen more as observers who read about a scenario and then react to a presented stimulus. So I want to present two different types of judgment studies. So one is the study of the just world hypothesis. So the initial work for the just world hypothesis was done in the 1960s, but it's still being investigated pretty thoroughly today. So these type of studies involve experiments in which people see or read about victims of unfortunate circumstances. So, and these unfortunate circumstances are events that threaten the need to believe that there's a just world out there. And so what happens in these studies as people are observing others who've been victims of unfortunate circumstances, people tend to either really negatively evaluate the victim. So participants believed that bad things happen to bad people in order to maintain their idea that we do in fact live in a just world. Or they blamed the victim in some way. For example, if they had just done like XYZ, they wouldn't have been in that situation in the first place. So essentially, these just world hypothesis studies are ones where participants are told about a situation, they're asked to reflect on this situation, and then draw a conclusion or a judgment on that situation. Another type of judgment study involves the fundamental attribution error. So basically, the heart of the fundamental attribution error is that people tend to infer stable personality characteristics from observed behavior, and they tend to ignore the situational aspects of our behavior. So when somebody's behaving a certain way, people tend to draw some sort of, oh, they must be this type of person, instead of saying, well, I wonder what the situation is that is potentially influencing them to act that way. For example, say somebody is giving a speech in front of their large lecture course. So say my 101 class, which is a 200 student course. I tell the students they have to get up and talk about a psych topic in front of the other 200 students. So students may infer a high level of anxiety from a student due to their nervous behavior when asked to deliver the speech. So maybe they're fidgeting or stammering, or they're sweating, something like that, and they may just assume, oh, that's a really anxious person. But in reality, their nerves and their nervous behavior may just be due to the situation itself. So it has nothing to do with whether or not they're an anxious person. It's just the current situation they're in that's stressful for them. So looking at a situation someone is in and making a judgment about that person. So essentially during these fundamental attribution error studies, people are observing the behavior of other people and then making an attribution or a cause to their behavior. So there are a couple of different types of independent variables. We can separate independent variables based on whether they cause behavior directly or indirectly. So this is something to keep in mind as we're developing Project 2, which is an experimental study. And we will be manipulating an independent variable for Project 2. So independent variables that cause behavior directly is basically where there's an external stimuli that causes a participant to act in a predicted way. For example, the number of Confederates in a room causes an individual to act a certain way, which we saw in the Ash conformity study and in the smoke-filled room study. Other times, however, we look at independent variables that cause behavior in a more indirect manner. So these are where independent variable affects or creates an internal state in the participant that motivates them to act in a certain way. So, for example, studies where people may first be given a questionnaire, and maybe the questionnaire itself is supposed to influence the way they're thinking. So maybe one questionnaire is regarding prejudice and the other one is given a more neutral topic. And the idea is that one group has been primed in some way to think about their own prejudice because they took a questionnaire regarding prejudice, and then they may be asked to make a judgment about something. So giving that survey creates an internal state of thinking about prejudice that may motivate them to act a certain way during the study. So when we talk about providing context for the independent variable, this is a very important part of our study. So we need to think about how we'll set the stage for our study and what we're going to say or write to the participants in order to ensure that our study is effective. So the instructions, which these instructions can be verbal, so told to them directly using our voices, or written. The instructions must be involving, so they have to engage the participant in some way. They have to be simple and straightforward. So it has to be in basic everyday language that everyone can understand, and most importantly avoids any psychological jargon, because there's a lot of different words we use in psychology that the general public doesn't quite understand. So you have to keep in mind that some of the people participating may not have any background in psychology, so they won't understand the jargon that's used. So it's good practice to avoid that type of jargon. Build in redundancy. So build it logically into the introduction. And then the instructions also must be task-oriented instructions. So task-oriented, we mean telling them what they're going to be doing, so what activities are expected of them, and in what order they will be doing it. So sort of giving them an idea of the procedure that they will be partaking in. And then lastly, it's important to verify that the instructions are understood. So give them an opportunity to ask any questions they may have before starting their tasks. So the delivery of the independent variable. So the number one goal in the delivery of the independent variable is consistency. So ensuring that all participants are getting as close to the same experience as possible, with the exception of that manipulation of the independent variable. So why is this consistency so important? Feel free to take a second, pause the video, and give yourself time to think about it. So, because typically I would have this as sort of a discussion question that we would do in class. So it's important because this standardization, so this consistency, allows us to be confident that there are no confounds in our study, that we can say with certainty that the manipulation of our independent variable caused some sort of change in the dependent variable, and there is nothing else responsible for that change or potentially responsible for that change. So continuing with the delivery of the independent variable. So delivering the independent variable means that when we are presenting the study to the participant, that we can do so in a couple of different ways. So we can introduce the independent variable in a couple of different ways. So the first one is where the experiment introduces the independent variable. So the experimenter themselves are the ones that are telling the participant about what they'll experience within the study. However, I will like to highlight, in an ideal situation, the experimenter remains blind to the condition, which means that they don't know if the participants are in the control group versus the experimental group. So they don't actually know if the participants themselves are going to be receiving the independent variable. Or a second way is where a confederate or a research assistant introduces the independent variable. So this was what was done in Ash's study of conformity. It was the confederates that introduced the incorrect or correct answer to the line judgment. So a research assistant will tell the participants what's going on. Again, we do this blindly, so we want to avoid the presence of demand characteristics. As a reminder, demand characteristics are where the researcher may behave differently towards the participants because they know what group, whether they're in the experimental or control group. As the experimenter, we also know the hypothesis of the research being done and the end goal of the experiment, so what we hope overall to find. So you may have some predictions that you carry with you on how you believe that the participants will behave. And this may lead to, even completely unintentionally or unconsciously, may lead you to treat the groups differently because if you know whether or not they're receiving that independent variable. So there's a couple of different modes that the independent variable can be delivered. So you can use, of course, verbally, so just telling them vocally what's going to happen. However, if you are relying on verbal transmission of information, it's important to write a script and stick to the script. That way we can still have that consistency, and we don't have to worry about people going off script and maybe unintentionally creating a confounding variable. Next is written instructions. So the advantages of written instructions include that all participants will receive the same set of instructions. When it's written down and you're giving them to the participants to read, you don't have to worry about potentially a research assistant going off script, or that participants getting a different experience when it comes to getting the instructions. And this also offers the researcher a high degree of control because they know exactly what the participants are being told. However, the disadvantages, one main one is that it may create a more sterile environment. So it may create a lack of realism because a lot of times in real life we are being told verbally what to do, whereas getting written instructions is a bit more rare. There's also the option to do a pre-recorded audio or video instructions. So before having participants start, you have them sit down and watch a pre-recorded video. Again, the advantage is everybody would receive the same video and you have that script, but again, the disadvantage is the same of it may create a more sterile environment with a lack of research or lack of realism, because that typically may not happen in real life very frequently. And then lastly, a web-based presentation of the study. So if your study is entirely online, so it may just be done through, for example, Qualtrics. So how many independent variables do studies have? And how do you decide how many independent variables you should include? So we did talk about this in the last lecture, but there's a lot of things to consider when thinking about how many independent variables you want to include in this study. So first, it's important to highlight the more independent variables you have, the more participants you are going to need. So if you've taken statistics, you probably know that an N of 30 per group is usually thought to be that number needed for statistical power when you're running your analysis. However, it can be very difficult to get participants, especially in in-person and lab studies. It can be fairly difficult to get enough participants, so this may create an issue. Additionally, something else to consider is that each independent variable you include has to have at least 2 levels to them. So what do we mean by levels? So when we're talking about levels, we're talking about the different conditions of the independent variable. So in the ASH example, for example, it was either being in the room with Confederates giving the correct answer, or being in the room where Confederates were giving the incorrect answer. So those are the 2 different levels or conditions of the independent variable. So for example, if you're using like a clinical trial and you want to look at caffeine, 2 levels may be a placebo, like a beverage that's not caffeinated, but still carbonated, so it mimics an energy drink, and then maybe you do 8 ounces of an energy drink versus 12 ounces versus 16. All of those would be considered levels of the independent variable. So one thing is we really have to provide empirical support for adding independent variables to a study. So this means you should have some sort of theoretical justification based on similar prior research when adding a variable. So basically, you can't just add a variable because you want to. You need to have some sort of theoretical grounds or justification for adding that variable and that can be based on prior research you've read or similar research that you've read. So it does make sense to add multiple independent variables because we as people are constantly impacted by a number of variables all at once. So there is some sense to adding the independent variable, but because ultimately the goal is, in social psych research at least, is to get a more accurate study of human behavior. But again, you need that empirical justification, that theoretical justification as to why you are adding that specific variable to your study. So what about individual differences? So while studying participant variables or individual difference variables or personality traits are things that are really, really fascinating and interesting areas of research, especially within the social sciences, they're not independent variables. So for example, gender or age. So those are really interesting areas to study, but they aren't true independent variables. Those are more considered to be quasi-independent variables. And that is because we can't manipulate them. or potentially it would be unethical to manipulate them. So for example, maybe you're looking at smoking behaviors, and since we as scientists know the negative health outcomes associated with smoking, we ethically can't have somebody smoke if they aren't already a smoker. Like, that's unethical. So you can still include these variables in your study, but they aren't those true independent variables because you can't manipulate or control them. So there is one thought of exception to this. So it might be possible to use a personality trait as an independent variable in a very clever design, so you have to get creative with it, that heightens a participant's awareness of that specific trait. So the condition or the levels of the independent variable would be one level where awareness is heightened of that trait versus one level where it's not. For example, if you're doing a study and your participants are all introverts who are divided into two groups, one group may be given a reminder somehow or be primed to be paying attention to the fact that they are introverts, whereas the other group, it isn't brought to their attention, and then you see how that priming may affect the dependent variable or the outcome of your study based on those difference, whether they were primed to remember that they were introverts or not. So when doing experiments, it's important to use what's called a manipulation check. So basically, this is just ensuring that your independent variable has the intended effect. So presumably, if the independent variable has an effect, we will see it through the changes in the dependent variable or the outcome. So meaning there will be a difference between the experimental group and the control group in regard to their dependent variable scores. In addition, experimenters use manipulation checks as an assessment strategy to determine if the independent variable had the intended effect on the participant. So did the participant actually experience the variables' different levels in the way that the researcher intended them to? So the most effective manipulation checks are considered to be internal. So they are evaluated in the form of a very subtle self-report survey that is given during the course of the study. So when I say subtle, I mean the participant does not know you are actually evaluating the independent variable effectiveness. So they give a really, really good example of this in the Done chapter, one of the Done chapters I had you read this week. So in this example, there was a study where participants either bumped into a table and knocked off a ton of papers, or they bumped into a table and only knocked off a pencil. So the participant did not actually bump into the table. They just set up the room to where when participants were walking by, they had to walk extremely close to the table, and then a Confederate pushed the table to make it seem like the participant had bumped into the table. So those researchers were presumably trying to manipulate the internal state of the participant, because when you walk into an exam room or a lab and bump into a table, knock over just a pencil, it's typically just something that's like, oops, no big deal. However, when you bump into a table and then knock over a bunch of papers, which creates a big mess, how do you think that would make you feel? So a lot of us would feel very embarrassed by that situation. However, the researchers wanted to make sure people actually felt that embarrassment, because occasionally you may run into somebody who says, oh, that wasn't a big deal, or that didn't bother me at all. But on the other hand, you may also run into somebody who may be extremely embarrassed just by bumping into the table at all, even if it was just the pencil that fell to the ground. So they did a manipulation check by giving their participants questionnaires that had subtle questions regarding embarrassment, And they found that those who had knocked all the papers off the table reported higher levels of embarrassment, which would be consistent with being in the higher level embarrassment condition. So in this case, researchers were interested in the impact of embarrassment on participants' performance on a different task. So I briefly want to discuss chapter 11, which was an Aronson and Aronson chapter. So basically this chapter was a description of some studies on contrast effects and the judgments of physical attractiveness. So it was a summary of actually two different studies that were done on contrast effects. So in study 1, the independent variable was the type of TV show watched prior to making an assessment on somebody's attractiveness. So one was a TV show with highly attractive women, and the other was a more neutral video. And in study 1, the dependent variable was basically having participants rate the physical attractiveness of a woman in a photo. However, thinking back to what you read, what was a major flaw in this study design? So the major flaw was that participants were not randomly assigned to one group or the other. This means that the men that were participating essentially self-selected which group they were going to be in, because there was a lot of coincidence involved. So the men who participated happened to be in the common room of the dormitory where they're showing the video with the attractive woman or the attractive women in it, or they happened to be in the common room of the dormitory that was showing the neutral video. So it was kind of like self-selection, and there was no random assignment. So participants did not have an equal chance of getting one condition or the other. This means that there could be other important differences related to television show preference that could have played a role on how they went on to rate that photograph. So it creates confounding variables or questions about whether or not their independent variable actually caused the difference or actually influenced the difference of ratings. So in study 2, they attempted to correct the self-selection bias from study 1. So in study 2, the independent variable involves seeing a picture of an attractive woman in an advertisement or not. So there was an ad that was written, and the two groups were an ad with just writing on it, so just the verbal communication, and a group that saw the same written ad, but that ad also included a picture of an attractive woman who was a model on it. The dependent variable was asking participants to rate the attractiveness of a woman in a different photograph. So it's actually the same photo that they utilized in study 1. And they found that those who saw the model in the ad actually went on to rate the photo of the everyday woman in the photograph as less attractive. And that's what we refer to as a contrast effect. So this is a really significant concern, especially in present times, given the emergence and the ease of access to things like Photoshop or ways that you can edit your photos to make you look quite different than you actually are. This can lead to overall lower self-esteem to those who identify as women and are engaging in that social comparison, so comparing themselves, so what they see in the mirror versus what they see in people's Photoshop pictures. But it also sends a message to those who are attracted to women that this Photoshopped woman, this Photoshop model, is what the quintessential woman looks like, and it's impossible for one to look like someone who's been Photoshopped. So that is all I have for you on independent variables. As always, if you have any questions, please reach out to me. I'm more than happy to go over the material. If not, I will be back next week with another video. Thank you.